In today's video I'll be painting some Dark Angels DeathWing Terminators to a fairly high standard, but I will be breaking down everything into easy to follow steps so you guys can follow along and paint your own elite Dark Angels veterans the way they deserve. I have to admit that I'm usually not the biggest fan of Dark Angels, mostly because their black library books never really managed to capture my attention, and because Ultramarines are just better in every way. But this year I just couldn't resist the temptation to get the Dark Angels battle box. They might not be my favorites, but you have to give it to them. The boys in green do look cool with their medieval style armor and weapons, and that is especially true for their Terminators. So if you're wondering how to paint those forest green robes, the iconic bone-colored armor and all those knightly heraldry and weapons, then let's paint some medieval space knights who are definitely loyal to the Emperor. Seriously, they are loyal. I would never paint space marines who have fallen to chaos, I pinky promise. And by the way, if you want to have this whole tutorial in a written form so you can follow along even easier, then there is a 70-page PDF on my Patreon with hundreds of pictures and all the explanations you need. You can find the link in the video description. We will start from a white primer this time. It doesn't have to be pure white, something like Grey Seer will work as well, but it's important that it should be as bright as possible. I actually tried this over a black primer, which is what I usually do, but the end result looked grey instead of the cream or bone color that I was going for, so I had to reprime the models and start from scratch. Acrylic paints are transparent and the underlying layers will influence the colors you paint over them, so learn from my mistakes and start with a bright primer. I started the actual painting by base coating the bone-colored armor using Dark Sand from AK Interactive. This color is the perfect shade of cream to get that iconic look from the box art. I used the airbrush to cover the whole surface of the models with this, concentrating on the armor but also hitting most of the rest of the model. We will repaint those bits later on and the bone color will be the perfect undercoat, so no need to worry about overspray. I thinned this with a little airbrush thinner, just enough so the paint comes out smoothly at a relatively high pressure. If you don't have an airbrush, you can also do this with a spray can if you have a nice bone-colored primer. Alternatively, this can also be done by brush, of course, simply painting all the armor with multiple layers until you get full coverage, but it will take you a lot longer. When I was happy with the result, I diluted some ICLO the same way as the base coat and sprayed this from a zenithal angle only on the panels that were supposed to be bone-colored, but once again not really caring if I hit something else as well. The only important thing is to only cover around half of each of the panels by spraying more layers in the middle to create a transition and a bright highlight on the top of the panel, where they would be hit by the light coming from above. You can see the difference here between the two models, one highlighted with the ice yellow and the other one still in the original dark sand color. The difference is subtle, but especially with the next step it will give us some depth to the armor. That being said, if you want to make the process simpler and faster, you could leave this step out and have the armor only in the original darker color. Now that we have the base coat and the highlight, it's time to add some contrast with a little shading as well. For this I diluted some whole red, this time a lot more than the two previous colors, and sprayed this from below, basically exactly the opposite way of how we did the ice yellow. I was trying to hit mostly the parts of the armor that were pointing towards the ground. For example, the underside of the arms, the inside of the legs, and in general everything else facing down. And in the deepest shadows I added multiple layers, making them darker to establish a transition. You can see the difference between the shaded and the non-shaded models here. The contrast might look a bit harsh for now, but that will change significantly once the other colors are around it. So for now just trust me that it will look good. Once again, this and the highlighting step can both be skipped if you are going for speed, but the end result will look much flatter and less interesting. I finished the airbrushing step by spraying some matte varnish over the whole model to protect the layers we have just sprayed. And once again, a word of warning, let the sprayed on layers and the varnish dry for a few hours before you start painting over them. If you don't, the layers might reactivate, especially when you make a mistake and try to wipe it away with a damp brush. I'm definitely not speaking from experience. I wouldn't make a rookie mistake like that, since I would never start painting immediately after spraying the models. Let's leave the armor alone for a bit. We will get back to it in a second to do more highlights by brush and to add some battle damage, but for now let's work on the rest of the colors, starting with the green. I used dark green in the base coating consistency to cover everything that was supposed to be green. Even over the bright undercoat, it is better to add multiple layers to get full coverage. And this is where using the airbrush will come and bite us in the rear armor. If you make any mistakes and smudge the cream, it won't be easy to remove it. Even with the matte varnish on, it can be risky to try and wipe away the paint with a damp brush. And if you use the base coat color with a brush, the finish and the tone will be quite different and it will stand out on the airbrush layers. And the solution is to, well, not to make too many mistakes, but if you do, later they can be turned into battle damage. My first highlight color was the same dark green, but this time I mixed 50% slime green into it. I started highlighting the folds with this mix, making some nice thick highlights wherever I felt the light would hit them. I also added some thin scratches connecting the folds to make the material look a little more interesting. Plus, wherever there was an edge, like the side of the ropes and the sides of the little shield on the captain, I also highlighted those. Then I switched to pure slime green and did the same thing, but making all the highlights a little thinner inside the previous ones. I also started doing something that I will follow on most of the rest of the model as well. I decided that the light would come not only from the top, but also from above the left shoulder of the models. This allowed me to mostly highlight the upper left side of all the elements, making the lower right side always a little darker. Ultimately, this makes it easier to decide where to place the highlights and the shadows, and it also creates a nice dramatic light effect that will make the end result way more interesting to look at. Following this logic, I concentrated the next highlights on the left side more and more as I was going up in brightness. I used frog green for this. This color has quite a bit of yellow in it, so it creates a nice brilliant highlight on the green. Finally, I switched to pistachio, which is basically half green and half yellow, really trying to paint thin highlights inside the previous ones on the most visible and prominent folds and edges. This is of course a lot of highlighting steps for a single color, so if you want to have a faster but probably also rougher looking end result, you could simply highlight with slime green followed immediately by pistachio. But we can also take this one step further. I loaded some burnt red into the airbrush, quite diluted, and then similarly to how we did it with the whole red on the armor, I glazed this from below into the shadow areas of the ropes and also covered most of the bottom as well. It is fine to hit the inside of the legs and the arms a little as well. It looks a bit harsh now, but with every color around and the base painted, it will make sense. Okay, with the green finished, I decided that I would like to see all the other colors base coated before doing any more highlights. So let's do some base coats next, starting with the reds. I used the same burnt red we used for the glazing on the green, but this time with a brush to base coat all the red elements. Once again, I was extra careful not to mess up the bone colors around them because red is really difficult to clean off. But some mistakes are inevitable, so we'll just turn the ones I didn't manage to wipe away into battle damage later on. Everything that was supposed to be gold got a coat of whole red. By the way, one important thing to note about base coating elements is that it's not enough if you cover just the front of them. You need to do the sides as well. Starting from a black primer, it's not a big issue if you leave them black because it can look like a shadow, but with a light primer they stay white, which looks terrible. And we started from a white primer, so now we have to carefully cover them either by running the tip of the brush over them or on smaller bits by overloading the brush slightly and letting the paint organically flow around the details. When I was done with this, everything that was supposed to be either black or metal got a coat of pure black using the same method. And all the white bits got covered by deck tan. Later I will use a shade over these, so if you want to speed up the process, you can just leave them as they are and differentiate them from the cream colors with the highlights later on. With that done, let's return to our bone colored armor panels and let's finish them so that we have the two main colors, the bone and the green, done. Then we can start working on the secondary colors. Our first order of business is to establish some definition on the armor. Since we used the airbrush for these, the spray got into all the recesses, and since they are the same color as everything else around them, there is no depth to them. So let's fix that. I took some Seraphim Sepia for this because it is the color that we also see on the box art and it is the perfect consistency for some pin washing. I absolutely do not recommend washing this over the entirety of the armor though. You will destroy all the work that we have done so far if you do. Instead, we are just going to drop this into all the recesses and around the rivets as well. This is actually quite easy to do as long as you are using a nice sharp brush. Most of the time you can just drop the wash into the recesses and it will fill them up. And for the longer ones, you can simply let the tip of the brush be guided by the groove while you are gently dragging it along the recess. Sometimes it's good to wait for the first layer to dry and then use another one over it to make the recess darker and add more definition. And while I was at it, I also washed this over all the white bits to give them some depth. Now it was time to add a little character onto the armor. If you don't like battle damage, you can simply skip this step, but I liked my Terminators to look like they have seen some action. First of all, I took some dark rust and used this to make a lot of random scratches and marks on the armor. I was trying to make them big enough that I can fit one more color inside later on, but not big enough that they would look like a smudge. I did a lot of them on the edges of the armor panels to make it look like the paint came off there. I just tapped the edge with the side of the brush instead of making a proper edge highlight. You can also do this with a piece of foam, dabbing it into the paint and removing most of it before tapping it against the armor. You can check my Space Wolves painting guide to see how to do it that way. That will probably look more random, but like this I could control where the marks are going and I wanted to see what result I can get with the brush. To go even further, I took some grey blue and painted it in tiny areas inside the larger marks, the idea being that you can see the naked ceramide where the paint layer was fully penetrated by whatever did the damage. Finally, I took the same ice yellow that was also used for the airbrush highlights, but now I used it by brush to edge highlight all the armor and to add tiny outlines under the battle damage, giving them more depth. Highlighting all the armor like this can be a bit tedious, but all the edge highlights combined with the pin washing I did earlier create a lot of definition. Even if you leave out the battle damage, I would at least do the washing and the edge highlighting stage. And if you're struggling with edge highlighting, I have a whole video dedicated to that on the channel, so maybe check that one out. And with that, we have the two main colors of the color scheme done. Now we only have to do the most important secondary color, the red. After that, we just have some routine things to paint, like the gold of the armor trim and the steel of the weapons. For the red highlights, I switched to Citadel paint, since not a lot of red paints can compete with Mephiston red. I painted most of the surface of the red elements with this, only leaving the original darker red in the shadows. I also highlighted every edge quite thickly. Then I did the same thing with Wild Rider Red, but by reducing the size of the area I covered, mostly concentrating on the bits that were facing the light and also making the edge highlights a little thinner. Finally, I took some Fire Dragon Bright and used this orange color to only highlight the edges that were facing the light. Since we're already painting reds, let's do the eyes and make them glow menacingly, befitting the fiercely loyal Dark Angels they obviously are. I made sure that the whole eye socket is painted black, then I took some white paint and covered the sculpted lens inside the eye. The important thing is to leave a black rim around the lens. I painted dirty red over the entirety of the white surface, adding 2 layers to make sure I had full coverage. Then I took the white again and painted it inside the red this time, leaving the rim around it again, but this time in red. This got a coat of red scarlet ink. This is super pigment rich and brighter than the dirty red, so it stands out as a highlight inside the darker red. Then, you probably guessed it, I took the white again and this time painted an even tinier surface inside the red ink facing to the front. I covered this with some fluorescent orange that stands out even inside the bright red I used before, giving us the nice glowing Terminator eyes we needed. Okay, time for some fun. Let's do the gold armor trim and the steel bits, and to make it more interesting, I will share with you some little secrets I picked up lately to make those look particularly cool. I started by painting the majority of the surface with medium rust on everything that was supposed to be gold. Despite the name, this is not a rust effect by the way, just a nice rich orange color. And of course I also edge highlighted everything with this. The next color in line was Sahara Yellow, one of the best colors to paint gold with in my opinion. I edge highlighted everything again, but slightly thinner than before, and reduced the size of the highlights to cover around 60% of the previous ones. I kept in mind that the light is coming from above and from the left, and I started focusing my highlights in the areas where the light would hit more, leaving the rest with less highlights and therefore darker. I went up in brightness even further with pale yellow, and I continued making the highlights even thinner and smaller. I also used small diagonal scratches with this on the border of the transitions to help them look smoother. I only highlighted the most visible edges on the lighter side with ivory, and I drastically reduced the highlights inside the previous ones. This color is very close to white, so I was trying to use it sparingly and leave plenty of the previous colors visible. Finally, I added some small but thick dots of white on the most visible edges and highlighted some of them partially, especially on the very top of the model, like the upper edge of the pauldrons. When I was done, the highlight placement looked good, but everything got a bit washed out as usual, so I used one of my latest little tricks. I took some transparent sienna inks, a darker one and a lighter one. I glazed the lighter one in between the highlights and the midtones, and the darker one in between the midtones and the shadows. These are super pigment rich and they bring back all the color we lost and more, but at the same time they are also quite transparent and won't obscure the details we painted. They are also much easier to work with than glazing with thin down acrylics. Alright, let's move on to the steel, which also includes painting some fancy looking highlights on the huge swords these dudes carry around. We will start out with something quite standard and do the first highlights with anthracite grey. The method here is the same as on the gold, only the colors change, so I will focus mostly on the swords. I highlighted all the edges and then decided that the half of the blade that is facing the light will get more and bigger highlights. I will paint 2 highlights on the light side and a single one with less brightness on the darker side. I stepped up in brightness using dark blue-gray, and with this color I started doing lots of thin diagonal lines coming in from the edges and finishing at the middle line of the blade. I spaced these out more where I wanted the transition to be, but in the middle I added more so they would form a single homogeneous highlight. I continued with pale blue, and with this I concentrated most of my edge highlights on the light side of the blade and painted even more diagonal lines, but this time only inside the previous ones. Ivory was next, and with this I only painted the light side of the blade, leaving the other one mostly untouched, and even on the light side I reduced the size of my highlights even more and made them as thin as possible. Before I finished everything with white, I once again resorted to a little trick to make the end result look better. First, I thinned down some burnt red to a glaze and painted this between the shadows and the midtones on the parts of the blade facing the ground. I added a couple of layers until I got the effect I wanted. On the side of the blade facing up, I did the same thing, but instead of using the red, I used super thin dark Prussian blue. And to finish it off, I took some pure white and only painted some partial edge highlights and some lines inside the biggest highlights on the light side of the blade. Now we are almost there, only a couple of small elements are left to paint, plus the base, which will make all the red shadows make sense. I highlighted all the ropes and Purity Seal papers with Deck 10, leaving the Seraphim sepia in the shadows, and then did the final highlights with off-white. The seals got a highlight on their raised elements with deep purple and then with a mix of deep purple and white. Finally, these guys also have a few leather elements, mostly some scabbards and sword hilts. Here I edge highlighted everything with orange-brown and then made a lot of intersecting diagonal scratches coming in from the sides. Then I mixed in a little white and did it again, but on a smaller surface. Finally, I washed over it with a little sepia ink I had left over on the wet palette from the gold glazing. Now the only thing left to do was to add a couple of transfers, especially on the scroll work of the shields and the pauldrons. Not even I am crazy enough to do a freehand when you have these transfers in the box specifically made for this. And with that, the models are complete, but before I reveal the final result, let me show you quickly how I did the bases so the red shadows make more sense. At some point while I was highlighting the gold, it dawned on me that I should probably add some terrain paste on the bases. So by now it was nice and dry, and to make things easier, I used one that was black. So now I overbrushed consecutively lighter and lighter colors, starting with whole red, then burnt red, mahogany, and finally cork. This leaves the base properly highlighted but still quite red, which fits in nicely with the red atmosphere of the models. To finish it, I added a couple of grass tufts, specifically ones that have a little red tint so they wouldn't stand out too much and call attention to the base. And with that, the DeathWing Terminators are done and the end result looks like this. I think they look quite cool for Dark Angels. They are not Ultramarines, but hey, nobody's perfect, except Ultramarines. But jokes aside, let me know what you think. Do you like how these guys turned out? What other chapters would you like me to paint on the channel? I hope you guys enjoyed this one. If you did, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe. But before I sign off, I wanted to remind you that the PDF painting guide for this project and many more besides is available on my Patreon. And my Patreon members are the ones that make this channel possible, so they deserve a huge thank you as always, especially the ones in the captain level. And finally, this was the last video for the year, so thanks a lot for watching me in 2024. Have a great holiday and a new year, and I will see you guys in the next one with even more painting videos. Bye bye.